I guess that's our cue, some serious pump-up music. It's an honor to be up here to address a topic I think a lot of us in this room are very passionate about. So first I'll just introduce the panel briefly and then we'll jump right into it. Tatiana is the VP of Global Resilience for Americares Virgin. Joel is the founder of a very cool company called Spin Global. Pravash is the Deputy Senior VP of Emergency Programs for Americares. And Margie is the head of manufacturing and mobility for industries for the World Economic Forum. So a lot of really, really incredible, both institutional and entrepreneurial insight up here. And what we're going to talk about today is the nature of the threats that we seem to be encountering or changing from a geopolitical perspective, from an environmental perspective. We all experienced COVID and how that drastically impacted the supply chains around the world. A lot of us were involved with the Afghan evac. A number of us in here have been very involved with Ukraine. And there seems to be this melding and meshing of humanitarian, economic, and conflict disasters. So how we deal with that as individuals, as entrepreneurs, as corporations, as government agencies is really having to change. And the folks in this panel, are very involved with both large NGOs that are providing frontline medical care, that are very involved with medical distribution in the pharmaceutical space, and then working at the community level all the way up to NATO. So how can we take it upon ourselves as CEOs, as part of larger organizations, to think proactively about how can we prepare for these types of situations? What happens when we're dealing with near-peer environments and the typical DoD contracting or company operations are all of a sudden rendered, in many senses, impotent? How can we look at proactively readying ourselves for that? So I think we just jump right into it and go for it. So Joel, I'm actually going to start with you. You really work at the hyper-local community level from a disaster preparedness perspective, but you're also doing a tremendous amount of work with NATO around the world. And looking at getting governments to think about systemically and proactive preparation, and especially you've been involved with Ukraine. I mean, talk to me about what that looks like from a stakeholder perspective. How do you garner trust, and how do you influence governments to kind of take you seriously and to adapt programs so quickly?
Yes, thank you, Jesse, and thank you to the Chamber of Commerce Foundation for the opportunity to be here today with my panelists. If you think back, I think about the word convergence, right? Traditional risks and geopolitical threats. And 9/11 was a lightning rod. COVID was a paradigm shift. And I think Ukraine is the new ground zero for resilience. And when we look at the conversation, we've heard a lot about humanitarian initiatives, private sector initiatives, public-private within the civilian space. There's a phrase I want to put out there for you all to think about, and that's the phrase total defense. So Norway is a thought leader in this space, looking at the connection and the nexus between civilian, military, NGO, private sector, individuals and families, looking at the convergence of all of it. And how do we take this into account in our approaches, in our policies, in our frameworks, in our programs, et cetera. And in the context of total defense, NATO has been saying for a few years now, resilience is the first line of defense. And so they've identified 7 baseline resilience requirements that they have charged NATO allies to build capacity and capability toward, including things like resilient energy, resilient communications, resilient transportation, population movement, things like continuity of government, and really focusing on enablement. Now, people think NATO, they think military alliance, but newsflash, it's actually much more than that. There's a huge civilian component here, where we're not just talking about enablement in the context of enabling military operations, but now we're having a conversation I think is really exciting. And it's about enablement in the context of how do we as nations enable the private sector and NGOs to step in and do what they do best. And I think it's a real huge paradigm shift that's occurred in the last few years, and I think there's 2 levels to that, right? There's strategic partnerships, and there's response-oriented partnerships. We talked a lot, actually, this meeting so far about a lot of responsive partnerships, but I'd like to draw our attention back to what's arguably the longest-standing public-private partnership in the United States of America, and that's the Federal Reserve. After the 1907 financial panic, JP Morgan pulled everybody into the room, and they got public and private working together. Now, for 100 years, they're looking at strategic partnerships, shaping and steering the environment. Whatever you think about the Reserve, irrelevant. It's a great example of a long-standing, viable public-private partnership. And I think there's an opportunity to learn from that as a model for and a framework for engagement to pull together disparate pieces. And I think we're still tend to be responsive and reactive in the context of chasing a disaster every 45 days around the world. So what I'm seeing in the context of NATO and in the context of the nations that comprise NATO is a new appetite and new energy around engaging the private sector. I think Ukraine exposed the fact that government capacities are limited, and that private sector and NGOs have been there. And so how do we be more deliberate about that? And I actually spoke at the Resilience Symposium this year in Riga and made a recommendation, which NATO adopted, to develop guidance, a national level, non-binding guidance on how to engage the private sector before, during, and after disasters. And there's really 3 paradigms that we need to think about here. Peacetime, which is one thing, crisis, and then also war. Very different paradigms for engaging, what that means, what that looks like. And I think I'll pause there for now and get back to some other questions, except I'll highlight one phrase, and that's how do we get to a point where we have preset relationships and preset conditions for public-private cooperation in the context of peace, crisis, and war?
That brings up a great point. A lot of folks, I'm sure were involved with Puerto Rico, and there's existing constructs and models for working to try to facilitate collaboration, but it doesn't necessarily work that effectively, right? If we're trying to kind of codify these working groups reactively after an occurrence, we've already failed in a lot of ways. And what you talk about is, getting in and how do you instill a culture of proactive readiness? And, with companies, it's massive, and you're all over the world. When you look to operate in these environments from a distribution perspective, from provisioning last mile, from a compliance perspective, what are you looking at from a private sector perspective to both instill a culture of readiness so when something happens, you're not scrambling? And how are you assessing, what are the factors that you're assessing?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I think it's certainly something that a lot of organizations struggle with. So I'll just level set as well. So I'm with Americares, so I'm on the corporate side. I know we've heard a lot of gov, a lot of NGO, EDUs, et cetera. So, but from the corporate perspective, we do rely on a lot of existing partnerships from the public sector. We routinely work with various government agencies. We have our Americares Foundation, where we work with charitable organizations, with grants, with donations. But also, when the business is making decisions, the business is determining which area do they want to grow, where are we extending our services to. From the global business resilience perspective, we work with them and we basically ensure they're prepared. There's a lot of mechanisms within how we approach planning and how we approach preparedness that have to work uniformly across our organization. We have multiple business units, so we're a global department, and we work with our domestic teams, we work with our international businesses. That has certainly been a very dynamic environment for the past couple of years. So we obviously have a lot of leadership support, but it's really important that we're still leveraging those systems and processes and methodologies that you do for planning. But you just expand it way out. It's significantly expanded. You have a lot more areas where potentially you haven't thought about planning, and we have to bring those forward. So certainly as Americares for the past 2 years, 2.5 years, even before then, we've been pulling that preparedness aspect very closely into our business and making sure that it's built into how we operate and determine what's critical and how we can make sure we deliver life-saving medications to the communities.
Interesting. And I wonder, it's to quote you, you said, what we measure is what we manage. And I wonder how many companies are looking at instilling this culture of proactive readiness and setting markers in place so when there's an occurrence, looking at their response time, looking at their ability to keep folks employed from an economic stability perspective, and just continuing on to be able to fulfill the mission. Pravash, the question is kind of building off of that from the NGO side of the house. Very large operation. You're running frontline medical in crisis zones and humanitarian zones. Obviously, the demand has increased tremendously. From the NGO side, how are you scaling, adapting, and kind of changing the organization to better interface with private sector partners or government partners?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and great to be with everyone here. I'm Pravash with Americares, and Americares has been working for nearly 45 years delivering medical supplies, medicines to some of those vulnerable populations around the world, and we currently are in about 90 countries, but we can't do that alone. The model that we had before was that very centered disbursement out of the US, but now we're working through nearly 4,000 partners around the world to provide life-saving medicines, to look at resilience building at health clinics, and and working in collaboration with local health systems, local governments, and companies that can provide the equipment, but also looking at the supply chains as well. So in places where there are complex environments, be it Haiti or Syria or Ukraine or Afghanistan, we rely heavily on the type of partnerships at a local level through civil society, through those local health partners that understand the complex environment that we're part of, have the relationships, have the trust, and because we're in the health sector, it's doctor to patient, nurses to patients, and so you really need to make sure that information is utilized in a way that builds trust and confidence between the people who need services and those that are delivering services. And so what we also do is help those health clinics build up emergency preparedness plans, help build their systems, and attend to their needs so that they can be the frontline service providers, while we as Americares are providing resources, financial support, as well as standards that mirror the best practices that are out there in emergency response. And obviously this is an area where we can't do it alone. We have to be able to always have the collaboration with groups like, well, Americares Bergen, which is partners, the foundation side, that's supporting us, and then also at a localized level where financial support through local companies is increasingly important. For example, our Americares India portfolio is actually an independent organization now with its own governance structure, and that utilizes resources within the private sector in India and coordinates with local government and local health authorities to deliver services. So what we're seeing in an ever-increasing complex environment are just crises compounded over each other, be it natural disasters, be it human-made disasters, that make sure that we have to be agile enough to respond and start sowing in the seeds of resilience from the minute that we have emergency responses. And historically within the aid sector, it's been kind of this Janus-faced operation of aid workers and the longer-term development specialists that haven't always clicked, and part of what we're trying to accomplish in Americares, along with other partner organizations, is really strengthening the fibers between emergency and longer-term sustainable development through the lens of resilience. And so even internally, we have to become sharper at doing so and ensuring that our own systems and our own standards are set up so that we can pivot and be agile, and from the days from not only the first emergency, but as people said before, that preventative side, really building in structures and planning that allow frontline workers and the most vulnerable populations own and lead their own responses with our support.
So I'm hearing that there's really kind of a people element and a systems and a data element to this whole thing. And what we see is obviously there's frontline organizations, there's frontline responders, there's folks who kind of fulfill the supply chain in an emergency type of situations, but there's also a lot of companies who are not in the space, right? And I think given the nature of the threats that we're facing and the magnitude of the economic impact, I would kind of pose this to the panel in general, and I want to get the data perspective first, but how do we help people understand from an economic perspective, from a cultural perspective, that they are critical last mile infrastructure? Whether you're an insurance company, whether you're an app, a rideshare app, all these organizations, and not to harp on Ukraine, but what's been really interesting to watch unfold there over the past year and a half is the informal nature of the response and how companies completely outside the sphere of any kind of response or resilience ecosystem rapidly adapted to leverage their infrastructure, their employee base, and their companies for impact. So how do we, I would love to talk to you about the data element, right? How do we get people to understand there's a massive economic advantage to proactively training the staff and hardening their systems from a supply chain perspective to do this? And I think that would probably start from a data perspective and having a dashboard and an objective data set to work from. Do you want to talk about that and the work that you're doing in that vein?
Yeah. Picking up on Pravesh, you mentioned the word trust. I think that trust is absolutely fundamental in achieving shared intelligence data ecosystems that give us the ability to then use that data that exists in trillions of bits every second being generated, but what is the insight that can be garnered from that enables us to recognize through whichever lens we are looking at it, the impact that can have on the next decision we make. that has an impact on a life that's at the end of that supply at that system. And I think that, so just stepping back a second, the World Economic Forum is engaged across multiple stakeholder groups, across multiple value chains, across 20 industry sectors, looking at how do we bring together, and it is a coalition of the willing, how do we bring together leaders who are at a point in their career where they have the ability to make decisions that can have very far-reaching consequences for future generations of leaders. Perhaps not the immediacy of what you do now may not be seen, and we can see this with the enormous systemic challenges that we are faced with, whether that be related to resilience building, and as a part of resilience building sustainability. But achieving that alone is significantly more difficult, if possible at all, than doing it through a collective. And the principle of bringing together global leaders who have the intent to serve beyond the interests of their own organizations, short-term objectives, which are absolutely necessary and fundamental, because without those short-term objectives being met, we don't create jobs. So the private sector's ability to create jobs is absolutely predicated on the fact that you need to be efficient and you need to have profits to generate those jobs. The question is, how are we actually deploying the capacity and the capability that we have within those organizations for an effort that sits beyond the immediacy of the next quarter or the next 3-year cycle? And many of the leaders that are coming into a room to talk about these systemic challenges have a real interest in how can we deploy what we have at our disposal in a way that makes sense, and through the whole of that deployment, make a difference. And to bring that right back to the data aggregation issue, is that we have significant volumes of data all around us. What we don't have is the insight that allows us to create the resiliency in a near real-time environment. We have it in pockets. Many organizations, many companies would not be profitable if they did not have a really deep and granular understanding of the movement of supply of goods through their particular supply chains. What we're talking about here is the aggregation of multiple supply chains across multiple value chains to give you an anonymized view of the performance of a system. Let's call it the food system. You could call it the movement of healthcare, but food is essential to everybody. It's not essential only to those who are in vulnerable locations like Africa. Of course, it can be incredibly important that tomorrow you receive that, where on our shelves we have sufficiency. The reality is that by aggregating that intelligence in an anonymized, trust-based fashion, not dissimilar to an example that I love to use is what IATA has done for the aviation sector, right? Absolutely every airline operator submits their data. There's no question of an issue related to competitiveness, conflict, or how are we going to monetize that data. The data is used for one purpose, to keep crew and passengers safe. And that purpose has been served very well because it's the safest form of travel we have today. Now, the question we all have to ask is, what does that look like in the interests of humanity? A supply system resilience dashboard, how would we develop that? Who would contribute to that? What kind of impartial governance would enable us to feel that we can sufficiently trust, whether it's a federated model or not, that we can use that data?
Fascinating. Thank you for that. So to riff off of that, I guess I would pose this as it's a branding challenge, right? I mean, anyone who's been involved with the response, whether it's the UN log cluster or FEMA, working with the JFO, it's funny to watch the resource communities all operate almost alongside each other, but never cross-pollinate, right? You've got the military guys and the NGOs and the humanitarians and then the economic stability experts, and everyone is just kind of marching along in their own kind of lane, and there's not a lot of crosstalk. How do we, in an informal and informal way, kind of celebrate and encourage interaction between resource communities that are typically very siloed? And I'll throw that out there. Joel, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. As I ponder your question and the comments around understanding, having economic insights, I think about where have we been as a community. We've been really good at looking at the built environment, the natural environment, the social environment. I think the economic environment, understanding the nexus between economic impacts and national security is something that we continue to need to grow in and understand. There's questions and comments around picking winners and losers. We're not talking about that. It's understanding risk and vulnerability, understanding how to stabilize those resilience baselines or community lifelines or those essential functions that need to be in place so that a community can thrive and self-heal. And so I think that the trust, I think, is a key component. I think about mutual need and mutual benefit as a theme someone earlier mentioned. I think it's paramount to this conversation. There's got to be mutual benefit for folks to work together. And if there's a faster, better option than what you're offering me through this partnership isn't going to go very far. And so, I just offer those considerations.
Back of that, Tatiana?
Well, from the private sector perspective, we certainly see the value of having those partnerships because we can go ahead and fulfill what we need to do. We obviously have infrastructure, a lot of investments in making sure we can continue our services. However, we have to work with those governmental agencies. There's a lot of good information sharing. There's opportunity for synergies, and a lot of times you're given access to other organizations in the particular impacted area, right? So if you're talking about a natural disaster, you're talking about a catastrophic zone, there's multiple companies and there are multiple organizations all operating in there. So you absolutely have to make sure you've got those partnerships, making sure that the aid can come in for local communities. You have to take consideration for mental health for the affected individuals and your own people as well, especially those individuals that have to go in there. So we've always had, even within the resilience industry from the private sector perspective, one of the professional practices is public-private partnerships because you have to work together. Information sharing is really important. Nobody can do it from a siloed perspective. You can't do it siloed in your company, and certainly from the region, you can't be siloed.
That's a great point. So how, if there's an acute response phase, right, I think all of us are proponents of proactive readiness, right? How do we get ahead of this and not just constantly respond and react and respond and react, because the nature of these disasters is just increasing in the frequency and severity. But how, as an example, just to play on that, how would an informal actor or a hyper-local NGO take advantage of what oftentimes is the most robust acute response infrastructure, which is local business, right? That's already pre-established, that has the supply chains, that has the warehouses, that has the local cultural, awareness. How might the people who really need access to that, to the drugs, to the medical care, come together outside of these very rigid constructs, which are not to knock them, they're important, but they often exclude the really, really local actors who need access to it most. You want to take that?
So I think there's a number of wonderful examples of that, and Joe Ruiz was up here earlier today, and we've partnered with, and I say we collectively, the LET, the Logistics Emergency Teams, which Joe is outlining, is a collaboration between UPS, Agility, DP World, and Maersk, the shipping company, working very closely together with the logs cluster, and has been for a number of years. The deployment is not just in terms of the transport aspect of how do we create sufficient capacity in times of disaster and prioritize cargo to enable the responders to use that space, but really how do we ensure that the reach that we have globally, those enormous global organizations with hundreds of thousands of people in 170 plus countries around the world, how do they harness the value of that local knowledge, that local resource, etc. And that is what the logistics emergency teams do. And so in a situation of crisis, the ability to actually clear pathways, and there are multiple examples of this across supply chain organizations that may or may not be a part of the logistics emergency teams, but undertake immediate response to support local government on the ground to help clear pathways, logistics pathways, to enable that aid to flow so that you're not sitting with aid that's actually, or food that's basically rotting because it cannot move through a disaster area. And so that example is one. And then to get ahead of it, you had a question about how do we get ahead of this? And those organizations have all contributed during the course of the pandemic to inputs to the Resilience Consortia discussion, but also the Global Resilience Supply System Initiative, which is about creating a dashboard, taking this aggregate data, looking at putting it onto a dashboard that is very simply, very high level, not dissimilar, one might think, to what Johns Hopkins did during the course of the pandemic, and putting out a dashboard that was super high level about the unfolding rate of COVID around the world, and depending on which lens and what your responsibility was, your ability to plan, respond, react based on that very high level, not granular detail at all, was immense compared to what it would have been without that dashboard. And so the premise is, what could we do that would enable that to occur? And so we've actually just put out a paper today together with the partners that participated in a pilot distributing ready-to-use therapeutic foods to West Africa together with UNICEF. And it's a fantastic result. The question is, how can we scale it, right?
I think America has done a tremendous job of doing that. How has it changed at all? I mean, given the scale of the responses that you facilitate, you have tremendous partnerships already in place, but have you had to adapt on how the organization, when you drop into new territories, to refine that process, or is it working well?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, just relying on our localization efforts and our partnerships are going to really drive a lot of the decision making. And I would also just caution, even at that level, we have to look at the power structures within the environments we're working in. It is nice to be able to connect in with local government or national government and the UN Logs Cluster and other NGOs, but too often we come into these environments and it's the same people talking to each other, and it's not inclusive enough. And especially in complex environments where there's political unrest or there's active persecution of governments towards different groups that don't get a seat at the table, and we can map out, be it the Sudans or the Ethiopias or the Myanmars or the Afghanistans, or the people that we're trying to serve where health is a human right for everyone. They need to have a seat at the table, and it takes organizations like all of us here and even through Americares to be able to actively ensure that there is enough voices represented in the decision-making process, be it from disabled populations or youth or women or the elderly or those that are ethnically marginalized, to be able to have a voice on the table of where the supply chain is going to go and what's the resource we're going to get, because too many times we've seen that exclusion take place. And so we really have a responsibility to ensure that they're at the table and proactively building out not only a response, but the planning into their localized systems, be it through local development plans, the planning and budgeting stage, and getting those financial resources in place. And this is where we need to be better advocates as well of making that happen, because we have the tools and the know-how to do so.
Yeah.
To add on that, I think if anybody interested in this conversation around logistics, supply chain, I think you need to look at what's going on in Finland. I think the Nordic countries are doing great in a lot of this topic of public-private, but Finland created 30-something years ago the National Emergency Supply Agency. You know, they convene really whole society in terms of, you know, local actors, big actors, and this was actually developed in the Cold War era. Actually, a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries developed an equivalent organization. Many of them didn't have the foresight after tensions with Russia dissipated last time, and so they actually disbanded their NISA. And so Finland still had it going, and during COVID, this became a lifeline for them. It really, I think, would demonstrably put them ahead in a lot of areas. And I think that it's an example of a steady state engagement. I'm a huge fan of dashboards. I love me some data, but nothing replaces, the convening and coordination, and, like, to your point, having everybody at the table and doing that in a systematic way around different functional topic areas.
I want to hit on that you guys both made such great points. I mean, yes, it does take data. Yes, there's a huge human element to this. But like a lot of the work we do, we run an organization called Tactivate, and I'm also running an NGO called the Defense Entrepreneurship Forum. And there's huge potency to informal networks and collisions that happen outside the construct of the traditional collaboration and coordination machines that, as you said, aren't necessarily accessible, A, from a data perspective, and B, just from a people perspective. Right? How do we get the local actors, the real hyper-local actors, talking and coordinating? And it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And from our experience and our perspective, again, private sector plays a massive role in this. And we're here to talk about, in a large sense, private-public partnerships. But what does that mean? How does that happen? Like, it's this very nebulous thing that in theory sounds really cool and really powerful, but in execution, unless you're a behemoth of an organization or have a department to facilitate that, it's a really difficult thing to make happen, right? And they tend to come to fruition And what we've seen, I think we saw a lot of this with the Afghan evac for folks who are involved with that. We've seen a lot of this, I think, starting to happen in Ukraine. It's because people are in play. They have a corporate sector familiarity. They're familiar with the NGOs. They understand the importance of data, and they're just coming together, like literally in a bar, right? Or on some training operation. So the question is, and I think we'll have to end on this one: how do we make the idea of and access and welcome in the informal actors, the informal players with these massive NGOs, which we do, it sounds like you do, but how can we coordinate and connect outside of the log clusters while also respecting the need to tie in and to have some kind of formal capacity and oversight? Go down the line.
Okay, so I'm not going to be able to speak from the NGO perspective, but I do want to touch upon the point about localized systems, because even from a corporate perspective, we have to rely on our local resources as well. So certainly when you're talking from a geopolitical perspective, obviously we have Ukraine, we have Russia, Asia Pacific, environmental areas. You're dealing with different country regulations. You're dealing with very restrictive states, potentially a variety of situations that you really have to rely on that local knowledge. So even from a corporate perspective, when you're a global organization, you absolutely have to plug in with your local systems, and then from there, those SMEs, those participants, they're also plugged into their network. So we still have that vertical, localized, bringing it up to the impact of the organization, the local communities, the ability to fulfill our services, and then push it back down. So it's still very much of that local reliance.
Any other 30-second remarks?
Yeah, briefly, I've got 4 kids. It's hard to keep track of them sometimes. And, I think about why are people not included? So we tried to throw a birthday party for my son a couple weeks ago, and it's like, oh, shoot, we need to throw together a birthday party. It's our 4th kid. We need to show him he's valuable and we love him, right? So, but we forgot to invite a couple of people. Why? Because it was responsive, it was reactive, it was last minute. Inclusion can only happen if we're deliberate and thoughtful. And I think that we need to get out of this response-oriented mindset of partnerships that emerges. I love it. Kudos to all of you who emerge and show up as saviors in the heat of the moment. But let's learn from the Federal Reserve model. Let's plan 100 years in advance, and let's create a framework that's built to last that can include the whole community.
I would just say that, just to point out one example, in Ukraine right now, just reaching out to 93,000 people with mental health and psychosocial services is not possible without the work of our local partners, Family Circle, and the Ministry of Education that provides the platform and the credibility and the reach to be able to deliver these services. That in itself is convening a huge number of people, because if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of laws, that psychosocial services are the baseline to then be able to have a thriving economy, and from that we're able to make the connections with livelihoods and more political action, and especially for migrant and IDP groups that are moving between countries where their instability is so paramount that that's the first thing that needs to be addressed. So again, just emphasizing looking deeper into the inclusion space, and those people who are getting left out is our responsibility.
Couldn't agree more. I think that, coming from Africa myself, when you look at literally the trade situation, I mean, the examples are myriad, right? And collaboration, mindfulness, and the ability to actually foster partnerships that are going to have real impact on real people on the ground, and thereby lead a life of significance, as Madiba said. It's really about using the power that we have, be that a regulatory power, be that a corporate access to funding, be that the ability to have a shared intelligence platform that you can create, because that's your superpower, to quote Joe again this morning. It is about that collaborative, mindful, conscious decision-making. Come to the table, bring that superpower, bring that ability to have the impact on the ground with significant reach, because we are global organizations largely, and that translates into local execution.
Beautiful. I couldn't wrap it up better myself. So hyper-local, make sure all the stakeholders are involved, and a little bit of data. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.